By the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, the now ancient arguments concerning race and the integration of whites and blacks would once again dominate Louisiana's consciousness. While Louisiana was largely spared the violence and tragedy that occurred during the civil rights movement, it nonetheless shared the shame and lack of progress shown by many of its fellow southern states in regard to race relations. In the end, illness and the strain of the civil rights movement would be the undoing of Earl Long, ushering in a new era in Louisiana's politics and its history. 4 years of good government followed the election of 1952. A very large array of candidates lined up since Earl Long was ineligible to run for another term in office and had to wait out 4 years. Carlos Spott was Earl Long's candidate. William J. Big Bad Bill Dodd, also a Longite, who came from the state of Texas and moved to Louisiana. Then you had T. Hale Boggs. He was part of the Morrison campaign machine, representing New Orleans. And Robert F. Kennan from Minden, Louisiana, the reform candidate. James McLemore ran as a segregationist candidate. Kermit Parker. You also had Lucille May Grace, the first woman gubernatorial candidate, a staunch opponent of Boggs because she believed that Boggs was too soft on communism. And then you had Dudley LeBlanc, a had-a-call salesman. In other words, he was a throwback to the old days of those guys that went around the West selling all these potions and so forth that really didn't do much. In the runoff, it was Spott versus Kennan, and Kennan defeated Spott in the runoff. And this just basically shows the overall mantra of people in the voting machines who they choose change every now and then. They don't always keep the same in office. Now, of course, Earl Long was far from gone from the political scene. He simply could not run for governor anymore, and Long was famous for his quips and his statements. For instance, he said, "Don't write anything you can phone. Don't phone anything you can talk. Don't talk anything you can whisper. Don't whisper anything you can smile. Don't smile anything you can nod. And don't nod anything you can wink." That's the kind of stuff that Earl Long came up with. Bob Kennan was the antithesis of Earl Long. Quiet, studious, not big on flair. He ran a civics book approach to government, enacted finance reform, civil service reform. He attacked organized crime. He wanted a corruption-free government. And Kennan was what you call a maverick Democrat, one of the many Southern governors who supported Eisenhower, who was a Republican, in the election of 1952 over the more elitist Northeasterner Adlai Stevenson, who represented the Democrats. Cannon finished his term very honorably and decided, of course, that he could not run again and he might wait it out for another 4 years. And this, of course, meant Earl Long was back. And so the election of 1956 had Earl Long against Morrison. Now, T. Hale Boggs was the one that many thought was going to be in the runoff in 52, but charges of communism had basically sunk his campaign. And then Earl Long, of course, said, no, Boggs can't be a communist. My good friend T. Hale Boggs can't be a communist because he's a good Catholic. And calling him a Catholic meant that he lost all the Protestant votes in North Louisiana. So Morrison decided that he was going to run in Boggs's place in 1956, and Boggs instead would go to the United States House of Representatives. Long won in the first primary. However, in Earl Long's last administration, he began displaying erratic behavior, much of which is documented in the book, The Earl of Louisiana. He would lose large sums of money at the track. He cavorted in the quarter with Blaze Starr, a notorious stripper, also having other girls in the car as well. Long, during this period, was sent to a mental hospital in Texas, and it started a major adventure that resulted in Long achieving his release. Part of the reason he was sent to the mental institution is he gave a long, rambling, incoherent speech on the floor of the Senate. Many people surmise that he may have suffered a mild stroke during the process. Others say that this was simply his wife being very vindictive and upset because of his cavorting with Blaze Starr and others. There is the famous stripper and dancer of New Orleans, Blaze Starr, subject of that terrible movie. Yet another Louisiana politician making the cover of Time magazine, Earl Long, making the cover, but unfortunately the artist took some liberties and made Earl Long look like an aged Huey Long more than Earl himself. And you see him in the shadow of the kingfisher with the river of gold and so forth. What caused the major strain on Earl Long was the attempt to subvert the rights of blacks to vote in Louisiana. Earl Long was very much in favor of blacks voting because they were a large part of his base. But there were plenty who did not want African Americans to vote, such as Willie Raynoch, who was the arch segregationist of Louisiana. He attempted to disenfranchise blacks. He was part of what was known as the Dixiecrat movement. The Brown v. Board of Education was issued in 1954. This overturned the Plessy decision of 1896 and mandated that schools desegregate with all deliberate speed. Now, there were a few incidents of violence in Louisiana, and many of the Louisiana congressmen and senators signed what was known as the Southern Manifesto. And the Southern Manifesto stated that senators and elected officials would all do their best to oppose, in fact, or in word, the Brown decision, stating that Earl Warren, the Chief Justice, had overstepped his constitutional mandate in issuing the Brown v. Board of Education decision. At the same time, you had plenty in Louisiana who were incredibly in favor of the Brown v. Board, and they were the civil rights leaders of New Orleans. The man in the picture there is Alexander Pierre A.P. Thoreau, who now has a street named after him. Ernest M. Dutch Moria, one of the first black elected officials in Louisiana post-construction. The Reverend Avery Alexander, the Reverend A.Z. Young, and the Reverend T.J. Jemison. The elections of 1959-1960 were among the most noteworthy and watershed moments in Louisiana history. Earl Long had determined to become governor again. The Louisiana Constitution did not allow a governor to succeed himself, but Long was going to first try and see if he could force a constitutional amendment. When that failed, he ran Jimmy No for governor and himself for lieutenant governor, in which case No would then resign his office and make Earl Long governor yet again. In this race was Willie Raynock, the arch-segregationist, Jimmy Davis, who had attempted now to run for a second term in office. Remember, he had served from 44 to 48, and Chep Morrison. In the runoff, No finished out of the race, and so it was between Davis and Morrison. And Davis announced that he would run as a segregationist candidate, which forced Morrison against the wall. And Earl Long, then given the choice between Morrison and Davis, chose the segregationist Davis over Morrison. Why? Not because Long was a segregationist himself, it's just that he hated Morrison more. That sounds very familiar to what we are going through in politics today. One of the big brokers in this entire election was Leander Perez. Leander Perez was a descendant of the Isleños, was the political boss of Plaquemines Parish, and a very strong power broker in St. Bernard Parish. Leander Perez was a vicious racist and segregationist, and no doubt bombed a Catholic church in Pointe-a-la-Hache to keep it from integrating. When his statements showed that he was at least sympathetic toward those who bombed, Archbishop Joseph Francis Rummel excommunicated Leander Perez from the Catholic Church. Now, remember that the Isleños come from the Canary Islands, who have a strong, close connection to Africa. And yet there is Leander Perez. You see him on his big horse, the political boss of Plaquemines Parish. He is very much like the segregationist that you see in other states. He's a descendant of Isleños who have African roots. And there you see self-loathing. Great deal. During the war, for instance, Leander Perez was a closet Nazi sympathizer, at least a German sympathizer, and often traded oranges and citrus with the Germans for little favors and German chocolates and things like that. And it was, let's just say that this right-winger was hardly the most American of patriots in many ways. His street that was named for him in St. Bernard Parish used to be called Judge Perez Drive. It's still called Judge Perez Drive, but it's been named after a different Judge Perez. He was called Judge, although he was the district attorney in Plaquemines Parish, not really a judge. A little addendum worth noting is that Leander Perez managed to convince Earl Long to sue the federal government over the oil field rights, and that's one of the reasons why Louisiana does not receive its fair share of the oil field revenues. There was a deal in place, and Leander undercut the deal because he hated Harry Truman so much more than he wanted the money for the state of Louisiana. Another addendum is that Earl Long had lost his attempt to succeed himself, and many said that this was the end. He's now out of politics. However, to everyone's surprise except his own, he entered the seat the race for the congressional seat in the 8th District of Louisiana does not exist anymore because we now have only 6 congressional districts, soon to be 5, that was held by his late brother George Long. He won the nomination and then won the office. However, before he could take office, he suffered a heart attack when the night of his election. He checked himself into Baptist Hospital in Alexandria on September the 5th, 1960. Earl Long woke up, had a cup of coffee, lit a cigarette, and then collapsed and died in his hospital room. He was buried in Winfield, Louisiana, and his cousin Gillis Long eventually took the seat and served from 1962 until his own death in 1984. He died on the day of Ronald Reagan's second inauguration. What Earl Long did not have to face because of his death at the age of 65 was Judge Skelly Wright, a federal judge who enforced integration in Louisiana. And those who are students of the integration crisis that went on in the 1960s will tell you that it could be one of the most vicious times in U.S. history. Judge Skelly Wright oversaw the New Orleans desegregation of schools. Now, Morrison, who had learned his lesson in the last gubernatorial election, did not speak out in support of integration and, in fact, made overtures toward resisting it. Overly zealous lawmakers tried to enforce segregation. They were constantly rebuffed by Wright in federal court. They, of course, turned and called Wright an activist judge, which he really was not because he was enforcing the law. And finally, at last, McDonough No. 19 and William B. France elementary schools were integrated. There were many people that would show up and protest out in front. Many of those folks would then be excommunicated from the Catholic Church, especially when they showed up in front of the cathedral to protest the consecration of an African-American auxiliary bishop in New Orleans by the name of Harold Perry. The desegregation crisis caught the attention of Norman Rockwell, who had his famous picture of Ruby Bridges being escorted by federal marshals. Notice that they are all white, and you never see the faces of the marshals. You only see the face of young Ruby Bridges going to school at William B. France Elementary School, which is on North Galvez Street near the Musicians Village, and it has been completely restored and rebuilt as well. It's called The Problem We All Live With. Jimmy Davis's first administration as governor in 1944 to 1948 was a rather nondescript administration. He spent most of his time in Hollywood making movies and did nothing as governor, so he left a surplus. His second administration was less admirable, shall we say. He built the Sunshine Bridge over the river at Donaldsonville, Louisiana, about 3/4 of the way to Baton Rouge from New Orleans. He believed that this would spur the growth of the petrochemical industry, which it in fact did. But at the time, it was considered to be a huge boondoggle and a way of giving his friends jobs. He strengthened the ethics code, at least the ethics code for other folks. He increased state investment and increased student loan availability. But he built a new governor's mansion, which is almost palatial. the governor's mansion of Louisiana. And the problem is that the old governor's mansion, which is still there in downtown Baton Rouge, was a perfectly good governor's mansion. There was no need for a new one. Again, it was seen as a way of giving jobs. And then there was also the Baker Bank scandal. He also created the State Sovereignty Commission, which was pro-segregation. Essentially what it did is it created a commission based on Mississippi's commission. That's always a good thing to do in a civil rights. Notice my sarcasm. It was given unusual powers to investigate citizens of the state and used its authority to exert economic pressure to suppress civil rights activists. The gubernatorial election of 1963 pitted the candidates led by Delaceps Morrison. Now, without having to worry about Earl Long, Morrison felt that this would be his best chance for election as governor of Louisiana. He was opposed by Bob Kennan, who was running again for good government, Shelby Jackson, Gillis Long, who was now representative of Earl Long's 8th District, and John McKiffin, a very progressive, forward-looking individual if ever there was one. However, in the runoff, Morrison and McKiffin faced off against each other, and McKiffin fell back on the tried but true methods of race baiting. He used racial invective and defeated Morrison. And this shows a complex aspect of politics, that sometimes politicians will say certain things but do other things. McKiffin used racial invective and then basically turned around and started supporting the civil rights initiatives of Lyndon Johnson. Now, this does not excuse him from what he did to obtain office, but at the same time, it shows how politics can be a very complex thing. By the time John McKiffin had become governor of Louisiana, Louisiana passed a constitutional amendment allowing a governor to serve 2 terms. And so John McKiffin is the first governor in quite a long time to serve 2 consecutive terms. His administrations were socially responsible. It kind of showed Louisiana was reintegrating itself back into the American political mainstream in certain ways, not in all ways. He undertook state ethics reform, gave the state a better bond rating, and to show that he was using the rhetoric for election but was pursuing a different course. He actually improved race relations and became a promoter of race relations throughout the city. He collaborated with Hale Boggs and Dave Dixon to bring the National Football League to New Orleans. At first, it was going to be the Oakland Raiders were going to move. Al Davis was going to move the Oakland Raiders to New Orleans. The problem is that the segregation problem had not yet been solved. And Al Davis was many things, but he was not a racist. And so he declined. Well, by the mid-1960s, Hale Boggs was majority leader in the United States House of Representatives, and together with F. Edward Hebert, they managed to steer federal antitrust legislation through Congress for the benefit of the National Football League, which was now under a great deal of pressure from the new American Football League. And as a reward for this, and with a little bit of arm twisting, on November the 1st, 1966, the city of New Orleans was awarded a National Football League franchise. In the lobby of the Pontchartrain Hotel on All Saints Day, 1966, the New Orleans Saints came into being. Dave Dixon also was a forward thinker who believed that the city of New Orleans, because of its heat and its weather, would be best served if it had a domed stadium. John McKithen, when he saw the plans that Dixon had, said, "We're going to build that sucker." And that's how the Louisiana Superdome came to be. Louisiana economics in the 1950s and 60s saw an agricultural decline, but an industrial expansion. The International Longshoremen's Association was established, one of the first big unions in Louisiana. There was a major increase in oil and gas production. There was also some auto manufacturing in North Louisiana. And there was a population increase. However, in New Orleans, it did not increase. New Orleans was 628,000 in 1960, but declined to 593,000 by 1970. Louisiana life of the 1950s and 60s saw changes for women because the laws had remained very archaic regarding women. But there were women pioneers in both race and political spheres, and sometimes in both. Mary Baker Cubby Parrott was born in New Orleans in 1883. She was educated in public, private, and business schools. She married Robert Stagg Parrott, a commodity rice buyer. In 1924, after the couple moved to Eunice in St. Landry Parish, she joined the civic community, tried to join the all-male Rotary Club, organized a fair, and became known as a woman involved in almost every worthwhile cause in the community, even tried to establish a black chamber of commerce. Louisiana music focused on people such as Antoine Fats Domino, who just recently passed away after a long, great career in which musicians like Elvis Presley and even the Beatles said that he was a forerunner of the common rock and roll that we have today. Jerry Lee Lewis of North Louisiana, who had a little darkness to him. He married his first cousin, but his music is still listened to today. Goodness gracious, Great Balls of Fire. Sports in Louisiana, LSU were the 1958 national champions. The first national championship for LSU. In 1959, Billy Cannon had his famous run against Ole Miss on Halloween night, defeating the Ole Miss Rebels on that famous 89-yard punt return. Grambling saw the establishment of Coach Eddie Robinson and making the Grambling program a funnel for the National Football League. He had boxing and boxers and boxing instructors like Willie Pastrano. Louisiana education increased in student enrollment at all levels. Governor John McKithen believed that every Louisiana high school graduate should be allowed into the state universities. There were increases in African American opportunities as well. But as McKithen said, with every high school graduate getting in, there was some decline in standards for collegiate education. Louisiana saw its share of natural disasters. Hurricane Audrey hit Louisiana on the Cameron Parish, Texas border in 1957. It was the deadliest storm since the unnamed storm of 1893. This led the way for the increased call of storm warnings. Hurricane Betsy hit New Orleans' Ninth Ward and St. Bernard Parish on September the 8th, 1965, prompting a rather immediate response from President Lyndon Johnson and the new Archbishop of New Orleans, Philip M. Hannon, who had come down from Washington also, toured every flooded area of the city in a boat, offering the churches comfort, along with other church leaders. Many people in Hurricane Betsy died in their attics as they climbed into their attics to get away from the floodwaters. Leaders called for increased flood protection and the end of the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, which has now finally been closed. New Orleans Mayor Victor Schiro won re-election largely based on his performance during Hurricane Katrina, as he was out there filling sandbags for the public consumption. New Orleans life and politics of the 1950s and 1960s also saw some serious changes. Chet Morrison had been appointed ambassador to the Organization of American States, but he would die in a plane crash doing his work. Victor Schiro was the mayor of New Orleans, a very colorful figure, oftentimes bowed to the segregationist aspects of New Orleans. He was also comically derided as being the only man to have 2 emergency appendectomies in his life, and they were both at election time. New Orleans Parish District Attorney was Jim Garrison, who would make national headlines for his pursuit of Clay Shaw as one of the possible conspirators in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Norma Wallace was the famous Madam of New Orleans on Conti Street. The Greater New Orleans Bridge, now called the Crescent City Connection, the narrower of the 2 spans, was first built in 1958. And that had a great deal of effect on the neighborhoods around it. The New Orleans Saints, I said already, entered the NFL in 1966. Tulane University decided to leave the Southeastern Conference in 1966, choosing to focus more on academics. Many people have said that that was one of the worst decisions Tulane ever made. General Charles de Gaulle visited the city of New Orleans, and now we have a street named for him on the West Bank. And you also saw the introduction of the Super Cruise, Endymion of 1966 and Bacchus of 1968, trying to give Mardi Gras a new look, a more inclusive look at Mardi Gras, rather than the old staid carnival clubs of Rex and Comus and Momus and Proteus and so forth. I draw your attention to this picture of the New Orleans City Council because seated at the lower right of your picture is James Edward Fitzmaurice Jr., New Orleans City Councilman, 3 times a candidate for mayor of New Orleans, lieutenant governor of Louisiana, and a candidate for governor of Louisiana. He is my grandfather's first cousin. This is a picture of Magazine Street during the 1950s and 1960s. Notice how smooth the street is. The reason being is they had just taken the streetcars off of Magazine Street. What you see there in the picture is the beautiful tree-lined North Claiborne Avenue in New Orleans. That's the St. Louis cemeteries on the right-hand side. North Claiborne was a wide tree-lined boulevard, and now, of course, it has the Interstate Expressway on it. One of the reasons that it was put there is that it was an African-American neighborhood and people didn't give it as much regard in the new interstate highway boom. The other reason is, and I was just in Louisville, Kentucky recently, is that the interstate was supposed to go along the riverfront. And in Louisville, it does go along the Ohio riverfront, and unfortunately, it really mars the view. And many people said no. And so the preservationists won, but instead they destroyed an African American neighborhood in the process. By the middle to the end of the 1960s, the state of Louisiana entered a period of transition as the old Long political machine declined after the death of Earl Long. However, a young, ambitious congressman from Crowley, Louisiana, soon entered Louisiana politics, and once again he would bring both fame and negative publicity to Louisiana. His name was Edwin Edwards.